Today, it is truly my honor and privilege to introduce and welcome Ralph Preiss and his daughter, Jacqueline Weitzman, who will be sharing Ralph's story with us. And afterwards, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. I'm also so happy to introduce them today because this is their first time speaking through our museum. And so we are on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, thank you both so much for joining us today and for sharing your story with us. We are so happy to have you, and you may begin.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my story with you all. My voice has been a little hoarse lately, so my daughter Jacqueline is here with me, and she'll take over some of the narration. I'm talking to you from my home in which I've been living since 1958.
Sharing the screen.
Due to COVID, I've not traveled much. And so I'm using this wonderful new technology to address you, something I never would have guessed or imagined in 1958 when we were designing the first fully transistorized computers at the IBM laboratory where I worked for 37 years. I'm getting ahead of myself. I was born in Germany before Hitler came to power. As a Jew, I wouldn't be here today to tell you my story if it weren't for the humanity, political courage, and generosity of the open door policy of Philippine President Manuel Quezon. And I'm always grateful for the opportunity to tell this important story as a witness so that President Quezon's legacy is not forgotten. My mother's father was Dr. Adolf Süßbach, a retired army doctor who had risen to the rank of general in charge of hospitals on the Eastern Front during the Great War. My mother, Margaret, was the youngest of 3 children when my grandfather retired from the army and took the job of country doctor in the town of Rosenberg, Upper Silesia. Her older sister, Erna, had already married a Berlin lawyer, and her older brother, Egon, had become a surgeon in Berlin. So my grandfather, my grandmother, Bertha, and my mother moved into a new farmer's house with a country yard, with a courtyard and a stable, which he used as a garage for his car. The house was large enough to afford a waiting room, office, and several examination rooms. The living quarters were upstairs. There are also servants' quarters and a room for a chauffeur's family. It was within walking distance of the Rosenberg Hospital. So Mutti, my mother, grew up in Rosenberg, went away to study nursing, but then moved back into the house to work for her father. For that, she got her own car, a yellow convertible, at the time when most people in the town were still driving horse-drawn vehicles. My father's side, the Lindner family would trace ancestors in Germany back to 1740. All were professional assimilated Jews who contributed to the fatherland and reveled in its culture. My father's mother, Rosalia, was the only daughter in the Lindner family. She had 3 children, a daughter, Ellie, and 2 sons, my father, Harry, and his younger brother, Bertold. My father's father, Hugo Preiss, a shoe salesman, died in 1924 on the operating table during a blood transfusion. My father's brother Bertold died in 1933, racing on his motorcycle through a train crossing. My father's sister Ellie survived the war in South Africa and visited us in New York in 1958. The Lindners were a tight-knit family who held an annual meeting at some resort. They called it the Vettern Convent or Cousins Congress, where they made fun of each other in poems and staged plays in which the children also participated. My father, Dr. Harry Preiss, was a veteran of World War I, where he was a private in the German Medical Corps. It's important to understand both families considered themselves German first and foremost, and only Jewish by religion. In 1926, my father was assigned by the German Civil Service to join the practice of Dr. Zuspa, who was reaching retirement age.
In this map from the 1930s, you can see Breslau, where most of Harry's uncles lived and where he went to university. And you can also see Rosenberg. The hospital is shown on this picture of the main street through town, and looming out in the far end of the street, you see their beautiful synagogue built in the 1830s. The Susbach house and doctor's office was across the street from the synagogue. The hospital was used for operations and serious diseases, and children were typically born at home, and my grandfather always needed a chauffeur-driven car to get to the house in time to deliver them.
So inevitably, my father, Harry, fell in love with the boss's beautiful daughter, Margaret. My parents were married the following year. That picture is the only time I noticed he was taller than my mother. They moved into my mother's childhood room as a couple and integrated into the Zuspa household. I was born in 1930. Here I am with my baby nurse. The Rosenberg Synagogue is in the background, and this picture was taken from my mother's window. My early years were idyllic. My grandmother spoiled me. In early 1934, my grandfather Zusbach passed away, and we moved into a new two-family house, one of 5 that my father had built on the outskirts of town as an investment in the growing town of Rosenberg. The other 4 houses were rented out to other townspeople. Naomi Zusbach moved into the left side of our duplex, and we lived on the right. You can see my grandmother and my mother in the upper windows. A glassed-in porch connected the 2 halves in the back of the house, so we could visit each other without going outside. Also in 1934, with Hitler's rise to power, all Jewish members of the civil service lost their jobs. My mother's brother, the surgeon, and his wife almost immediately emigrated to Shanghai, which at the time was an open port city, so anyone could find refuge there. My mother's sister, Erna's husband, the lawyer, also lost his job. He emigrated to Paris to practice law. While he studied for the French bar, my aunt and cousins Frank Archer and Ernst Olaf came to live with us for a year. The boys shared a room with me, and as an only child, this year of having 2 cousins to play with was a highlight of my young life. Even though he was Jewish, My father didn't immediately lose his job because there were not enough Aryan doctors to serve the public needs in Rosenberg. So he ignored my uncle Aegon's pleas to leave Germany at the time. After my aunt and cousins left for Paris to join my uncle, Eric, my mother's mother, Omi Zusbach, took care of me. We were very close. My mother continued her work in what was now my father's medical office. In 1936, I started public school and proudly saluted my Führer every morning. I remember clearly my shock when one day my teacher called me out in class to say I was no longer allowed to salute the picture of Adolf Hitler, since Hitler is not the Führer of Jews. Shortly after that, the other Jewish children in town and I could no longer go to school with Aryan children. And we had to take a train daily to attend a Jewish school some 21 kilometers away. On returning home from school, I was sometimes attacked by older boys who chased me, threw stones, and called me dirty Jew. You can imagine how quickly I learned to run very, very fast. Finally, at the end of 1937, my father lost his job when an Aryan doctor moved into town. My father converted the back porch of our duplex house into his office where he could treat Jewish patients. And though it was against the law to treat Aryan patients, I remember local farmers whom my father had been treating for years and who trusted him, coming to him for care, and they would leave game or produce as payment.
No longer able to support the family, though, Harry desperately searched for ways to leave Germany, finally answering an ad in a Jewish paper stating that the Philippines was looking for physicians. They later learned that of the 400 applicants that summer, his father was one of 20 lucky ones to be accepted. A little background on the extraordinary story that led to that fateful advertisement Harry answered. In 1935, the Philippines had become a commonwealth under President Manuel L. Quezon. He is one of the heroes of this story, along with the 5 Frieder brothers of Cincinnati, who ran their 2 for a dime cigar business out of the Philippines. Before 1937, there had been a small Jewish community of about 150 families in the Philippines. But then Jewish refugees fleeing from the fighting in Shanghai began to arrive in Manila. Alerted to the plight of the Jews in Germany and Austria, the Frieders decided to take action. Over games of poker played on the veranda of the Frieder home with President Quezon, with Paul McNutt, the US High Commissioner, and Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, an aide to General MacArthur, the commander of the Philippine Army. They hatched a plot to earmark 10,000 visas to the Philippines for German and Austrian Jewish professionals and farmers. President Quezon was impressed with the kibbutz system in Palestine, where the Jews had made the desert bloom. The Philippine Jewish community, of which a Frieder usually was the head, had to guarantee that they would support the refugees coming to Manila. So, with the help of the Joint Distribution Committee in the United States, funds were raised to guarantee the visas. Ralph's parents had never heard of the Philippines, so they looked it up in their encyclopedia, and they read that this country in the South Pacific was a Spanish colony since the late 1500s, and Spanish was the common language. So while they waited for their visas, Harry knew just what to do: study up on tropical diseases and enroll the family in Spanish lessons. Margaret also took a class in corsetry, since they were advised that she would need to support the family while Harry prepared for his medical exams to get his license when they got to Manila, the Philippine capital. The visa to the Philippines was to be issued by the United States consulate in Breslau, the nearest big city. Harry assumed then that Spain did not have a consulate there. On the morning of November 9th, 1938, Ralph's parents drove to Breslau to hound the American consulate for their delayed visas and to spend the night with Harry's uncle Alfred and Aunt Lena and other Lindner cousins. This left Ralph and Omi Sosbach at home alone on what was later to become known as Kristallnacht.
I remember it clearly, being awakened in the middle of the night to the sound of the shutters of our house being ripped from their hinges and the breaking of windows on our ground floor. Omi and I hid together, shaking with fright in our attic air raid shelter. Then we heard gunshots and shouting, the running of feet, the slamming of car doors, and the screeching of wheels. Our Aryan neighbor, teacher Langer, the father of my friend Günther, a Hitlerjugend member, had scared away the hooligans who were attacking our house by firing warning shots with his gun into the air. The hooligans weren't locals, we were told later, but hired hands from neighboring towns who didn't know my parents. Teacher Langer helped Omi clean up the glass, hang up sheets over the broken windows to keep out the cold November air. That night, they also burned our beautiful synagogue. I remember going with my grandmother to the synagogue on Friday evenings and holidays and sitting with her in the women's section upstairs, and I would watch the service hanging over the rails. That night, I could see the flames from my bedroom window, and I suffered from terrible nightmares of that fire for a long time afterwards. Later that evening, the Gestapo came to our house to arrest my father, but Omi was able to tell them the doctor was not home. In good German tradition, it was expected that he turn himself in on his return, so they left. Back in Breslau, Uncle Alfred and cousin Hans were arrested by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp. Upstairs in the house at the time of their arrest, my father wanted to join them, but my mother kept him from volunteering. My father thus stayed in hiding in Breslau to avoid arrest until our visas to the Philippines and freedom finally arrived in January of 1939. We later learned that the delay was caused by interference by the US State Department.
They were forced to sell their real estate holdings to Nazis at their price. And even though they were not permitted to take any money with them, they were allowed to take a lift with their belongings. So Harry, refusing to leave all his money to the Nazis, bought medical equipment to outfit a small hospital. They also had tropical furniture specially built for them. There were all sizes of tropical clothes and shoes for a growing Ralph. And they also took a Torah scroll that had been saved by a friendly farmer and given to them when their synagogue had been burnt down during Kristallnacht. Margaret had to make all of these final arrangements herself, and Ralph remembers Gestapo officers would come to the house with their dogs to check that they weren't packing anything that was not allowed. On the way to Manila, they first stopped in Paris to say goodbye to Ralph's cousins, which at the time they didn't know would be their final farewell. It was not until the 1970s that we learned of their fate from Nazi documents unearthed by Beata and Serge Klarsfeld, chronicling the shameful roundup of Jews in Paris in the summer of 1942. The entire family was detained and then deported to Auschwitz on 3 separate trains. Ralph's uncle Eric on one, his aunt Erna with Frank Arthur a week later, and 12-year-old Ernst Olaf, all by himself 3 weeks after that. On arrival, they were all murdered. A picture of my father's cousins is on display in a barracks at Auschwitz, which has been converted to a memorial to the murdered Jews of France, with one room devoted to the French children who perished there. We have visited Auschwitz a few times now, and 6 of Ralph's grandchildren have seen his cousin's photos there. This is a picture of Ralph's 4th birthday party. His cousins were in attendance, along with his friend Horsty and his sister Marion, and his good friend Katie Karminski and her older brother Rudy. Rudy was 3 years older, but they both enjoyed tinkering with mechanical toys. Ralph loved visiting Rudy in his apartment above his father's company's office that had a lot of mechanical machines in it. He remembers they always used to watch cards running through the machines and dropping into different pockets. And the operators then ran them through another machine that printed them like newspaper presses. They were fascinated, almost hypnotized by the operation. Ralph did not realize then that he was watching his first IBM machines in action. Of course, in Germany, the company was known as the German Hollerith Company. IBM would have been boycotted in the USA if people had known it was profiting from business with Nazi Germany. Ralph remembers he was not allowed to take his multi-piece, you pronounce it?
Tricksbaukasten.
Or Tricks building set into the lift. So he left it behind for Rudy to play with. While touring the toy section of the Munich Technology Museum in 2018, we saw his version of his toys on display. The Karminskis were trapped in Germany when the war started. Deported to Auschwitz in 1943, Katie and her mother were murdered upon arrival. And Rudy's father did not survive the camps. But Rudy did, living by his wits and building V-1 rockets as a slave laborer for Werner von Braun. Rudy and Ralph found each other again in London in 1974, and they were as close as brothers until Rudy's death in 2008. Horsty and Marion were able to get to the United States, and Ralph visited Horsty in Los Angeles when he first came to America. Margaret's mother was able to join his uncle Aegon in Shanghai and survived the war, but died shortly after. Her grave was destroyed during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. Aegon and his wife came to America just before the communist takeover. Harry's mother, my father's grandmother, Rosalia Preiss, stayed behind in Germany in an old age home and died in a cattle car on her way to Theresienstadt as part of Hitler's final solution. If not for their visas to the Philippines, it is more than likely that my father and his parents' fate would have been similar to those they left behind.
After leaving Paris, we took a train to Genoa, where we were to board the German liner SS Potsdam for Manila. I remember the train going through the Alps, through longer and longer tunnels on the way to Italy. Then we were stopped at the border and had to show our German passports. Ours had large red J stamped over the swastikas. This made the border guard look for an entry visa to Italy, which German citizens did not need. But since we were stateless, the guard made us get off the train, and we were detained till we were sent back to France on the next train. Again, rolling through the long tunnels, the train stopped at the French border. There, the French border guards checked our passports and found that our French visa had expired. So they took us off the train and sent us back to Italy through the tunnels and on the next train. This back and forth trip repeated several times till my father, in desperation that we might miss our ship sailing, spent all the money he had, 300 Reichsmarks, to bribe someone from the German steamship company to get guards to accompany us through the Italian border to reach the pier in Genoa and onto our ship. Talking with people on board, my parents found out that English was spoken in the Philippines. The encyclopedia that my father had owned and consulted was printed in 1898, the year that the Philippines were ceded to the United States by Spain after the Spanish-American War. My father knew little English from his studies, but my mother and I had to start from scratch. When we arrived in Hong Kong, we were told that the Potsdam had been rerouted to Japan. We would have to take another ship, the MS Tinagara, to Manila, which would arrive in Hong Kong in 3 days. We had absolutely no money to stay in a hotel in Hong Kong. Fortunately, a person from the Jewish community of Hong Kong offered to take us to the Jewish community building, which put us up for 3 nights on cots in the dining hall. Some nice people also lent us money to buy food and go sightseeing. On the 3rd day, we set off for a trip to Manila. We arrived in Manila in March 1939, and I remember being greeted at the pier by an imposing man in a white sharkskin suit. We later learned that this was Alex Frieder, who had headed the selection committee to recommend Jewish refugees to President Quezon to come to the Philippines. Philippine Jewish Committee settled us in a boarding house, and when our lift arrived, we moved into a house a block away from Temple Emil, the center of Jewish life in Manila. My father was able to sell his medical equipment to the newly built Mercy Hospital, where he found work as an X-ray technician while preparing for his medical exam. He was also able to settle his debts. Manila was a beautiful city. The boarding house was a block away from the Manila Bay, where the sunsets were spectacular. I could roam the streets freely on wide sidewalks. At first, I could only play with German-speaking kids. I had to learn English, which the Philippine Jewish Committee provided in our temple's Bachar Hall for kids of all ages. There I made a lot of lifetime friends, and soon enough I was making friends with the local kids in my neighborhood. I repeated 2nd grade, this time in English, at De La Salle College, a Christian Brothers kindergarten through 12, plus a 4-year college institution, less than a mile from our house.
Although being a physician was their ticket out of Germany, Harry was not allowed to practice as a doctor. He was not allowed to practice as a doctor in the Philippines because a law was enacted at the request of the Medical Association lobby that only Filipino or American citizens could practice medicine in the Philippines. But Harry was able to engage in a number of different professional pursuits, using his background in chemistry and a lot of ingenuity. First, he started a small manufacturing company producing lotions called Preiss, which were sold door to door by other Jewish refugees. In the fall of 1940, he took a job as medical supervisor at an American soft drink factory in Lilio Laguna, about 2 hours southeast of Manila. There, he improved the recipe of an orange soda drink by adding vitamin C and bottled it in brown beer bottles to protect the potency of the vitamin. He called it Tone Up, and it was sold to the US Navy for use in submarines to help prevent scurvy. Ralph stayed in Manila to continue his schooling at La Salle, boarding with his parents' good friends, the Castles.
In April 1940, my mother and I were privileged to attend a ceremony in which President Quezon turned over his Marikina estate to the Jewish community for the refugees to establish a model kibbutz, like in Israel. Mr. Frieder is sitting on the left. President Quezon is standing at the microphone. My ambition that day as a 9-year-old was to get the president's autograph. But as I approached the podium after the speech, the men started walking away. What should I do? I guess my mother suggested I stop them. These are frames taken from the feature film documentary Rescue in the Philippines. There I am with my mother. This picture of me receiving President Quezon's autograph appeared in some Manila papers together with President Quezon's speech at Marikina. In his speech that day, President Quezon said, "It is my hope and indeed my expectation that the people of the Philippines will have in the future every reason to be glad that when the time of need came, this country was glad to extend to a persecuted people a hand of welcome." Life changed suddenly and on Sunday, December 7, 1941. News came that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor and war was expected in the Far East. My parents were scheduled to come to Manila from Guerrilla the next day to take me to the hospital to have my tonsils removed. But we were awakened in the middle of the night by the house shaking. Arid sirens were wailing. We thought it was an earthquake, so in our pajamas, Mr. Castle moved us all to the street to join our neighbors. It was cold. I was trembling. I've never been so scared in my life. My teeth were chattering. In the sky were bursts of anti-aircraft fire, flares, and the sound of bombs exploding. Our house was located just 3 miles from the airport, which was the target being bombed. So we heard the planes screeching in the black sky, seeing them only when zipped through the lights from the flares, searchlights, or bomb blasts. This lasted the longest time until the all clear sirens wailed and we could get back to bed. In the morning, my parents called and told me, to my relief, that my tonsils operation had been canceled. To this day, I still have my tonsils. That day, school was closed and my parents took me back to Lilio and safety during the Japanese invasion that followed.
The family was once again lucky that by presenting their expired German passports with the large red J stamped in it, they were still considered German allies of the Japanese, and so were not subject to the brutal internment that Americans and other enemy aliens were subjected to during the cruel Japanese occupation. Since the bridges to Lilio had been blown up, they were cut off from communications. So the family moved to San Pablo City, a little closer to Manila. There, Harry established a soft drink factory with a Filipino partner from Lilio, Mr. Fernandez, and throughout the Japanese occupation, using local products, bottled a new vitamin C drink called Vitona. Harry invented a new way to recycle crown caps using rubber stamped from discarded tire inner tubes instead of cork, and capped the drink in washed, discarded beer bottles. Ralph enjoyed working with his father, pushing a cart to find recyclables, making bottle caps, and checking sealed bottles for sediment or ants. In the evenings, he studied with his father from German medical texts and novels to keep up with his education.
By 1943, I was back in Manila, living with Cantor Tisner and his mother while preparing to become a bar mitzvah. Once again, I attended La Salle, where the curriculum had changed to Japanese language, Japanese propaganda promoting the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. I remember in May 1943, the Japanese declared Philippine independence. Premier Tojo of Japan actually came to Manila to inaugurate puppet President Jose P. Laurel. Since his son Junior attended my class at La Salle, Our class was chosen to welcome the premier by waving Japanese and Filipino flags. During the ceremony, Tojo reviewed those in attendance and stopped right in front of me, demanding to know in Japanese, who is this tall white boy who was standing among all those Filipinos. Brother Adolf, our Japanese language teacher who led the attending class, explained I was a good German boy. Premier Tojo smiled and moved on. 5 months later, I became a bar mitzvah at Temple Emil, reading from the Torah we brought from Rosenberg. Then my parents took me back to San Pablo with them, enrolling me in the local school where I learned carpentry, farming, and animal husbandry. Also helped my father in the soft drink business. At the end of 1944, General MacArthur made good on his promise and returned to the Philippines. The bombing began again. Every morning, a P-38 flew over a house looking for troop movements to bomb or strafe. Found this fascinating, would often stand outside in full view to watch. Up to that time, the small Japanese garrison in San Pablo had left us alone. But a new Japanese commander who spoke perfect German came around often and borrowed German books from my father's library. This commander also played poker with another local German Jew, Mr. Chelesny, and once again, a game of poker played a crucial role in my family's fate. In late December 1944, over cards and drinks, the Japanese commander warned that he had orders to take the lives of 10 white people for every Japanese that was killed. From this, along with leaflets dropped by the Americans urging civilians to evacuate San Pablo, my parents realized it was time to make preparations to flee. My father had already buried our valuables under the house, and he had dismantled his factory equipment and hid it in a nearby barrio. But word to evacuate came in late December, so our final preparations were sudden, and we had to leave our beloved dog Boogie tied to the front post of the house with a bowl of food laced with poison, so he wouldn't suffer at the hands of the Japanese. Our party of 20 left in the middle of the night in the final days of 1944, finding refuge on the slopes of Mount Banahao, creating a community of about 70, composed of 11 Europeans and the rest Filipinos and their families, of which 10 were gun-toting guerrillas. We also had about 20 horses. We were well organized, moving camp every week. My mother was part of the kitchen crew. My father was a member of the planning staff and also the camp doctor. I joined the scouting and lean-to building crews, learning to use a sharp bolo, a 2.5-foot long sword that would cut through coconuts in one slice and chop firewood and clearings through the jungle. Hiding in the jungle, we could observe the fighting below and the dog fights above. By early April, the fighting came closer to us. Most of the Japanese force retreated to the base of Mount Banahao. Our group was now caught behind Japanese lines, and we knew we had to sneak past the encroaching Japanese to reach the Americans. We descended the mountain in 2 groups, my parents in one group on foot, and I helped with the horses on the other group. My parents made it through first and anxiously awaited my group which was held up by an approaching Japanese force. The next day we tried again, but ran into a band of troops wearing what looked like Japanese helmets. Just before making a fast turnaround, I heard the soldiers talking in English. They were Americans equipped with new bowl-shaped helmets. We were liberated. During the fighting, most of San Pablo had been destroyed. Our house was completely gone. But to our great surprise, upon our return after 4 months, Boogie, free of his collar and chain, had greeted us among the ruins, emaciated and with a 50 caliber bullet stuck in his leg. Boogie and his bullet went on to live a long and happy life after that.
Temple Emil was the only synagogue on American soil to be destroyed during World War II. The Japanese had used it to store munitions, and they blew it up as they retreated from Manila. The Torah they had brought from Rosenberg was also lost. American servicemen helped rebuild the temple after the war. The month-long battle for Manila had been brutal, with fighting street to street, and many civilians, as well as a number of Jewish refugees, were caught in the crossfire. All of the brothers at LaSalle were massacred. Ralph saw this plaque at the school when he returned for a reunion in 2015. Adolf Gephardt was his Japanese teacher, and Baptiste de LaSalle was his favorite third-grade teacher. Ralph finished high school in 3 years in San Pablo after the war, and then began studying engineering at the University of the Philippines while waiting for his US visa to study at MIT.
After Twister destroyed the engineering Quonset in 1949 of the University of the Philippines, my visa arrived and I traveled to the USA to get my degree at MIT. I had intended to return to the Philippines to work for the Manila Electric Company, but I got hooked by a new technology, computers. I completed my master's degree at the University of Connecticut, where my MIT professor had taken me as his graduate assistant, and there I met my future wife, Marcia. 1954, I got my one and only dream job at IBM Poughkeepsie, designing, testing, and diagnosing computers. I thus remained in the United States and became a naturalized citizen.
Meanwhile, back in the Philippines, Harry and Margaret once again had to rebuild their lives. In 1949, they moved to Manila, where Harry worked for Estrella del Norte and eventually established a drug-producing laboratory factory called Estraco. In the 1950s, Harry introduced warfarin to the Philippines and helped save the sugar crop from an overwhelming infestation of rats. Ralph knows my grandfather was grateful to be able to do something for his adopted country that had saved his family. When my grandfather retired in 1968, they emigrated to the USA, where my father was still working for IBM, building large room-sized computers.
My late wife and I have 4 daughters, 10 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. We're all beholden to President Quezon for his vision and humanity. The Open Doors Monument stands in a park in Rishon LeZion, Israel, dedicated to President Quezon and engraved with the words, "I witnessed him speaking at his Marikina estate 82 years ago." This picture chose me with my Israeli grandson, Yonatan, during the dedication ceremony in 2009. My wife, Marcia, often reminded me that I was once asked about my feelings for the Philippines, and I replied that even though I love the United States, which has given my family and me so much, I'll always think of the Philippines as home. Thank you, President Quezon, for saving thousands of us. And with that, I'll answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your story with us today. If anybody has any questions, those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can use the comments section, and we'll answer as many questions as possible. And we'll give everyone a minute or so to think of some questions. I have a question for Jacqueline. Can you please share with us when you first learned your father's story in detail and how you and your family, what this experience was like for you and your family to hear this story?
I mean, my father, we were, how to begin? I mean, my grandparents would visit from the Philippines when I was a child. So we always knew that they lived there, and we were surrounded with Filipino art and food and culture, music. I don't think I really learned my story learned my father's story until third grade when I did that interview of you.
Right.
I
That's
think that
the
was
first
the first
time I
time.
ever talked about it.
And so third
So
grade,
the
so
other kids never bothered about it.
the early 70s.
Yeah. Yeah,
And then slowly, more and more, it came out, but it really wasn't until you had grandchildren that
right.
you really started to share your story and get this opportunity. And then in 2008 was really when things started coming out. But also in just in our local synagogue, there were a lot of survivors.
Yeah,
with a lot of stories.
Yeah, I spoke a number of times in different places. I never told you guys about, but basically it was you who started me out on it.
Yeah. And we continue.
Otherwise, I was too busy anyway working.
Do you think it was because you were too busy? You just put it out of your mind. You tried not to think about it.
Tried not to think about it, certainly, yes.
Mhm.
Another one?
Thank you for sharing. Do you know approximately how many Jews were saved with these Filipino visas?
Approximately 1,300 came there before the war. Of course, we're over 10,000 now. Somebody had calculated.
Yeah, once the Germans invaded Poland, no one could leave.
Right.
So that was sort of the end of this opportunity. Though Quezon, he originally was hoping for 10,000 and up to 1 million, we learned out recently. Recently, he was going to give a whole island to the Jews to settle. He was a visionary.
Yeah, unfortunately, President Quezon died of TB while he was in the United States.
Yeah, he went when the Japanese invaded. He went into exile.
He went into exile. Right.
We have a question and comment from Leonie Kramer. She says that her mother, Lottie, who was in Manila with Ralph, is watching this as well.
Right.
And she would like to know if there's been any progress in having President Quezon recognized as righteous among the nations.
No, the reason he is not being recognized as righteous is because he did not suffer. That is, his life was not in danger when he did do the rescuing. That is one of the requirements.
Though we do whatever we can to get his story out. There are a number of documentaries that tell the story. And we
Right, there's even a fictitious film about it now.
Kazan's Game by a
Right.
Filipino production company.
Again, they asked me about my story also before they wrote that.
Also, there's a play is being written by a Filipino playwright named Bonnie Alvarez. It's going to be read at the Skirball in Los Angeles on November 9th. I think it's open to the public. And it's based on my father's experience on Mount Banahao, but also with many Filipino characters to tell their story and how extraordinary it was for what they have done for the Jewish refugees.
Thank you so much. When did your parents pass away?
They were both 87 when they died. I'm 92 now, so.
Lolo died in 1983, 84.
84,
Mhm.
and my mother 93 or 94. Something
Yeah,
like that.
just
Yeah,
before my wedding.
right.
And did they live in the Philippines for the rest of their lives, or did they ever come to the
No,
United
they
States?
came here when they retired in 1968.
But they were there for 30 years.
Yeah.
Though a lot of the Jewish refugees left Manila after the war.
Right after the war, my parents stayed longer, yes.
And
Thing is, Manila had been, we did not live in Manila, we lived outside the city. So therefore, we were able
To rebuild.
to rebuild. Yeah, people who lived in the city lost everything during the war, so they tried to leave Manila as quickly as possible after the war, if they had a chance.
thank you. Did
We
your
can't hear-
parents? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, we did not hear what you were saying.
I was wondering if your parents ever talked about this experience and their family in Germany or anything about this with either you or with your children.
No.
No. And I, when I think of my grandmother spending over a month having to deal with the Gestapo and other German administrators, and to prepare their house and get the lift together to go to the Philippines with the unknown and say goodbye to her family, that she was completely alone. That's sort of extraordinary. And I wish I had known that to ask her about it, because I did spend time with her, but she did not speak about her experiences. And I did not think to ask, which I regret to this
Oh.
day.
Well, she didn't want to be reminded either, I don't think.
Thank you. How many days were you in the mountains before you were rescued by American soldiers?
I think we were rescued sometime in April, and we went into the mountains in late December. So that's it.
About 4 months.
Yeah, a little less than 4 months.
Now, remember, you were surprised when you learned that it was so long. You had thought it had
Yeah.
been a few weeks. You were having
Yeah,
fun.
well, yeah, it was an adventure to me. I mean, here I was with a big bolo, I never used that before, and we were clearing the forest basically, or the jungle, and
You were
built
camping out.
built houses,
Lean-tos.
lean-tos to stay in. Yes. To me, it
What
was
did
fun.
you do for food and water?
This particular mountain was full of springs. That's why the soft drink factory was in Lilio, which had running water from springs from Mount Banahao. Yeah, in fact, we had what was known as flush toilets. They were running streams, running at amazing speed by the house, and we just had holes in our bathrooms, which we used as toilets. So we had flush toilets that way.
Okay, let's go to food on Mount Banahao.
Yeah. Yeah, food unfortunately was sweet potatoes growing wild. And we did find game and lizards and things like that to eat.
Coconuts?
Coconuts, of course, yes. And certainly there was a little stream where you could wash. Very cold water, but when I came to school to MIT, I used to take cold showers, and the kids next to me didn't like me splashing cold water on them.
That's what you were used to.
But that's what I was used to, yes.
You started your talk with a description of what seemed like a very happy and peaceful childhood with your extended family. Can you please share a little bit about that and just about what point in Germany you and your family realized that your life there was not going to improve with certain conditions?
We really we lived in an area where we were well established, well known. My father delivered most of the kids in the town of about 5,000 people. And so we didn't really feel the problem until my father lost his job. Basically, when he was fired, when that Aryan doctor arrived. Before that, my father felt fully integrated with all the people, and we never had any. I mean, even my friend who was in the Hitler Jugend, he was my best friend, a neighbor's kid. So there was no anti-Semitism there at all.
Thank you. We have a comment here from someone who listened to your talk and said, I visited Auschwitz for the first time this past Monday, just landed back in LA, and I'm grateful to be listening today. With every heartbreaking thing I witnessed and learned, your story and incredible experiences have added to my growing knowledge and necessary heartbreak. Thank you for sharing in so much detail with all the photographs. And my question is, can you define how you personally maintained hope and courage?
I don't know. Sorry. I just had to go on living. And we did not really find out about what happened till after the war, of course, like everybody else. I mean, President, well, at that time, General Eisenhower insisted when he found those camps, he insisted that the townspeople living around the camps actually go witness what there was in those camps. So he was surprised himself, and everybody was there. The Germans had kept everything very, very secret.
Your parents also really protected you.
Yeah, true. But I don't know that they ever worried, other than when we couldn't get into Italy.
Also, you always said that because of the luck, time and time again in your story,
Yeah.
that you feel like you've been living on borrowed time.
Absolutely.
And I think that's been a lot of your philosophy, why you are a very positive person.
Right.
And it's been important to you to live to your fullest and to take advantage of.
Exactly.
And to share this
And
story.
I'm very happy to talk about it nowadays. In hindsight. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. And just one concluding question, how can people get tickets to the play reading at the Skirball? Is that something, that you can see on the Skirball's website?
It must be, yes.
I think so.
I would assume so as well.
Yeah.
So to anyone in Los Angeles who's interested, I suggest visiting the Skirball's
And
website.
we will be there. If you're there,
yeah,
come and say hello.
The play is called Mix,
Which is a translation of halo halo, which is a very sweet Filipino dessert.
Right.
And the idea of the play is the mixing of the cultures of the Jewish refugees and the local Filipinos.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, and both of you for everything that you do to share this lesser known part of Holocaust history. And I actually have a concluding question for both of you. As you've mentioned, this is the first time you're speaking for our museum, and we're so happy to have you both here. But you've spoken and shared this story many times with other organizations. Why do you share this story, and what would you like your audience to take away from hearing it this afternoon?
Mainly two things. One, honoring President Kazan for what he has done. And the second thing is that there were some good people there also, that not everybody is bad. There were good Germans too, and there are good people all over the world that at least try to help. And the Jewish community especially is very helpful. The Jewish community in Germany told us exactly that we had to, that my mother had to learn some trade which she could support us with the first few months that, or the year that my father needed to get his degree again, or his license to practice. So they advised us what to wear and so on. So those things were all given to us by the Jewish community. Similarly, the Jewish community in Hong Kong was able to care for us while we were there those 3 days. Without any money, without anything. Here, they just dropped us off, period. And we were stuck. What does one do when one is stuck like that? You depend on other people. And then in the Philippines, we immediately, the guerrillas took care of us. So wherever we were, there were other people who helped. And there are good people all over the world that can do that. And not everybody is bad.
And it's also important, I think, to put a human face on individual survivors. We have fewer and fewer, unfortunately. So to have a recording like this is wonderful. And I think it's important. It was not a black and white experience. It was in color. It happened to real people. And so to have these, to be able to tell this story is valuable.
I thank you for the opportunity to pass it on and have it recorded.
Well, we thank both of you so much for being here today and for sharing this story, and for your willingness to teach our community about this chapter of Holocaust history that, as you mentioned, is not so widely known. So thank you both so much for joining us today and for being with us. And I also just want to let everyone watching on Zoom know, I put a link in the chat to the Skirball event. So anyone can look at the chat and get that information, but you can find it on their website. And again, we just thank you both so much for sharing your story today, and for teaching our community.
So much for having us.
Thank you so much, and welcome to our museum community. Even though you live on the East Coast, we look forward to seeing you at the museum at some point.
We may do that too.
We would love to have you. So thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and thank you, Ralph and Jacqueline.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Michael.
Bye.